Okay. Well, thank you for joining me, Louise. It's really appreciated. I'm a big fan. Those who have been a part of the association, what we've done over the last, I think formally it's 5 years now. I've just been beating the drum of Dr. Louise Burke's work and Marco Mountjoy stuff. I was like, came across energy availability and I was like, wow, this is explaining so much of the stuff that I'm observing. So that was really cool. Eric Helms can attest to that. Anytime he gets on a podcast or anything like that, he'll say, oh, Alex Thomas is the EA guy. If he's at a conference, he'll be like, is Alex here? This is an EA thing, so make sure you're listening. So yeah, this is really cool for me. So we're getting into a few questions and really looking forward to hearing some of your insight into your experience on the industry over the last 4 decades, as well as sort of where you see things going from your position of experience as well. Yeah, we can edit this stuff as well, so it's all good. Yeah, recording. Yep, we're good. Thank you for checking. And Michael, to your point, because we made this mistake a while ago, I've got the right inputs as well. All right. So the first question that I have is, what was it like starting out in sports nutrition 4 decades ago?
Completely accidental. And maybe I should say I was 5 years old if it was 4 decades ago. No, I grew up at a time when we didn't get a lot of career guidance. You know, you were going to be a nurse or a teacher or a lawyer or a doctor. And I just didn't feel that any of those things really suited me and started a science degree. And it was only just by complete accident that one of the universities was switching its dietetic course and had some publicity about it, that I found that you could even study nutrition in the first place. And I didn't even know what a dietitian did. And I was studying nutrition at this course, so I switched to it. And the other really lucky thing for me was to be talking one day with one of my lecturers and noticing that he was eating quite strangely. Let's say he just had lettuce and cheese on his plate. And I inquired into this. And he told me that he was carbohydrate loading, or at least he was doing a depletion phase before carbohydrate loading for a marathon, because some Swedish researchers had just published a paper about how you can supercompensate glycogen. Now, I was a huge sports fan and I had not connected. I mean, I thought it was important, but I had not connected that there was actually some science behind this that would create a pathway for a career. And so it was just that random conversation then that sparks off in my brain, and I nagged that professor to let me just do some made up subjects with him. Do some private study with him, which then led to doing a PhD, because there was no career pathway. The only way that I could work in this area was to create my own opportunities. And so I nagged St Kilda Football Club to give me a position, an unpaid position, might I say. We're still trying to get that elusive premiership. And, through the help of people like Richard Reid, who was my supervisor and colleague, it was just making it up as you went along. So if I hadn't had that conversation, maybe I'd own a dress shop now. Have some completely different career.
I know what you mean by that. That's how everything with the association started. So my background is I only meandered through university, never finished anything. I got a postgraduate diploma in performance nutrition now, but I had to apply for the non-undergraduate pathway for that stuff. And the whole sports nutrition side of things started because I'm 34 now and was doing back then the human movement programs. And so I'd done a bit of commerce law and now I was in human movements, and I'd done some nutrition electives and sports nutrition electives, and opened a training and allied health center. Had a few of my good friends, colleagues who had graduated their programs, some were human movements, sports science, had a dietitian as well. There was about 7 of us to begin with. And my broker came in, the insurance broker was a client of ours as well, and was like, oh, the only one who's, just so you know, because you're the director, so you're liable, the only one who's covered to be talking about food in any capacity at the moment is the dietitian. We were like, you got to be kidding us. I was like, I looked at my HEX. I was like, I can attribute $10,000 worth of this to the subjects. And then we had another guy who was about another $20,000, $30,000. And one of them had actually done the dual, where it was dual bachelor's in exercise and human nutrition or something like that. And so I was just like, oh, this is really stressful. Here I am at 24, 25 years old at the time. I was like, wow, like, well, why are we spending this money learning things that we can't do?
Yeah.
And so I spent the next 12 months working out how we could get a framework in place for what performance nutrition was, to then get that recognized, and then where the line start and stopped with dietetics and how we can integrate with that. Because even at that point, there was this, and I would say it still is a wild west, but we're starting to have and gain more momentum with it. But there was no framework of what sports nutrition was as a standard, where clinical and medical nutrition would kick in, how we could integrate or anything like that. And fortunately, a colleague of mine, Dr. Cam McDonald, who's a clinical dietitian, he was wrapping up his PhD at the time, and we worked out a bit of a screening and triage process that we proposed to a group of insurers and underwriters, and they were to help us identify that line, where it was sort of like a green, yellow, and red light system, where it's like, okay, at the moment we get yellow and red, that's where we're bringing in the dietitians, that's where it's occurring. And then these people that have these sort of backgrounds in applied exercise physiology and performance nutrition, and they're clear on that stuff, so they understand what's going on at a biochemical level, they understand what's going on at a bioenergetic level, and we can sort of, then they can apply the research. We can start working with people for how to make them perform better, recover better, those types of things, and then not really be exposed doing so. And so it took me about a year, and then I had no intention of this ever happening. And then I got my staff covered. That was it. And then there was just this word of mouth thing where people were calling me up saying, hey, we want to get insurance for this thing as well. And I was like, I guess so. And then within about a year of that, the insurers are like, you should probably, like, there's a gap in the market here. You should probably look at incorporating like an association and to start regulating this, because you've got a spectrum of people with like PT, fitness, through to everyone that's got these degrees that isn't a dietitian, that we have no space for at the moment, where they could come to you if you wanted to do this, and you could have a code of conduct, a standard of practice, nominate what best practice is, those types of things. So I guess similar to you, it was one of these things where
Random.
100% random. I had no intention of, my intention was to have, like, what at the time it was, build this place where it was like a one-stop shop, where you would get screened by a physio, see a dietitian, have your regular coach that was in either like a ex-science student or an ex-science grad or something like that. And then from there, like everything that you needed was going to be catered for. And I had my first one and was doing quite well. And I was going to open like another 5. And that was it. I had no intention of that. And before then it was, play sport, until I worked out that I don't have the knees for it. And that was the intention. So I very much fell into this. And then sort of like 5 to 10 years later, it's like, here I am doing it. And I had no intention to even go into the countries and regions we did, but Dr. Sean Arendt, who's a colleague of ours, he came over. I hosted a conference in 2019, back when conferences were like a pre-COVID, where and people, like that, we'll probably get more views on a podcast video or a video highlight than we will like conference attendees these days in 2023. But that's the irony of it is, we had Dr. Sean came out, Laurent Bannock was going to come, but his father was sick. So Michelle, Sean's wife, presented. Who else? We had a few different international speakers, and it was great. And they were like, "Oh, what are you doing here in Australia is awesome. We actually need this." Sean was like, "Hey, we need this in America. We don't have anything like this either." And I was like, at the time, I was on the advisory board for the ISSN, purely because I was helping do stuff with them in Australia, and that's how I met Sean. And I was like, isn't that what the ISSN does? Like, and he was like, no, it's just a journal that has certification exams. Like, there's no, hey, this is a code of conduct. This is a professional standard. This is, we're going to introduce you to insurers to get a basic insurance policy. No clear scope of practice and things. So it was at that point that when he said that, then Eric Helms in New Zealand was like, hey, we should do something like that as well. And then Danny Lennon, who you know as well, was he was presenting there as well, and we're at this dinner, and that's basically where the inception of having a global association where we could standardize sports nutrition practices for non-dietitians came about. And so, yeah, it was pure accident. I enjoy it. Like, I love it, and it's fun. I get to meet some really cool people and really great humans. But yeah, definitely not something that I planned or intended. Yeah. So okay, so you've gone into what it looked like, and so it wasn't a thing. You fell into it. You volunteered for free with St Kilda, which I think is a really cool thing, right? Like, I think even grads nowadays, it's like, I think that's something that, you know, if you're prepared to volunteer for free, it means, you know, you generally you genuinely sort of in a good position for it. How does that compare to now?
So now there's structured career pathways, and so people can decide to specialize in this area of dietetics, and they can do courses. You've talked about being able to do, you know, double majors where you may have that other strength to your bow, whether it's through exercise physiology. There's some other interesting dual qualifications that people are pursuing. There's a lot of interest now in having a chef dietitian kind of interface, because then you've got more practical skills. And there's also, I think, an increasing interest in the whole coaching, implementation, behavioural science side of things, where people are not just trying to specialise in knowing what to offer an athlete in terms of nutrition advice, but how best to give that advice to empower the athlete to take it up, and how to, you know, how to influence behaviour. So there's lots of different ways in which the basic ideas around sports nutrition are being embellished, and people can have careers that you can plan for. So you can do the right subjects, you can have the right accreditation, and then, as you said, there's different bodies that you can be part of that provide continuing education and accreditation, and really help people to make lots of signposts so that you can get somewhere. Now, that doesn't mean that everyone's going to come out the same way, or that pathway is very traditional and only has one outcome. Because, you know, I think one of the great areas of growth now is just people just seeing niches, and whether it's through delivery technology and different ways of getting to people's brains, or whether it's, you know, those extra different skills, you know, whether they're soft skills or hard skills that you can add to your basic interest in sports nutrition, and then find a different way of practicing it. You know, people are just amazing in their innovation with the ways that they're developing new skills and new opportunities. So, you know, I see, and I know that there's sort of a limited number of key jobs, if you like. So, you know, there'll only be so many people that can have the head role as the dietitian at the Australian Institute of Sport, which is the job that I set myself the primary goal for in my life. And so there's, you know, there's going to be those key jobs that people will identify, but there's so many other ways in which people can still practice an area of sports nutrition. So even though you might say, well, there's a kind of a ceiling at one level, there's no end to people's imagination and innovation. And yes, it's an area where there's the opportunity for people to do things that aren't credible, and you know, they're not the good thing to do. But there are so many different ways, like you've just said, where you can see a niche and you can build some structure and some credibility around it that wasn't there before, so that it enhances the whole practice and helps other people to have a pathway to get there. So I see both an unending scope, but also recognise that some of the traditional areas, there will be dead limits on how many people can be doing them at any particular point.
I think, to your point, it's like, for instance, and just so any of the audience that listen or follow us or know of us can sort of, I can use an example to sort of really illustrate what you're saying. So, for instance, Dr. Reid Real is the head of the UFC Performance Institute in the Asia region there. So he's the head dietitian there. That's that one job that's taken up. Whereas Geordie Sullivan, who good friend of ours, and do you know Geordie as well? Know of Geordie? Or
yes, I know of Geordie.
Yeah. He just went out in private practice and made the name for himself that way. And so Reed works with a lot of professional athletes through his employment with the UFC. Geordie works with a lot of professional athletes, and at one point had 3 or 4 world champion mixed martial arts fighters within his stable. And their stable probably had 40, 50 professional fighters or has at any given point anyway. And he was just able to do that via private practice. So if you don't get that job or something, it doesn't mean that it's dead. You can still, achieve these things in other ways. Yeah.
But even in Reed's situation, he is the most incredible human being in the range of skill sets that he has in his personal experience in working with weightlifting sports. And for a long time, he did other things. In fact, he probably pursued the PhD at the AIS because that was one way of being able to work in an area that was really something he was passionate about. It wasn't a paid, highly paid position, and it was only for a discrete number of years, but at least he could say, well, that keeps me connected to the thing I love the most. And then he went and worked in a whole lot of other things before that perfect job came. And it was almost an idea his time had come for real. Like you couldn't think of a better match, but he had to wait. And now he's in that wonderful position. And there'll be continued growth of those special positions that will meet some incredible person's skill set and passion. And it's, it's just exciting to see how everything connects up.
Yeah, definitely. And so you mentioned before, you achieved your dream job with the head dietitian at the AIS. What has your experience been with some of these, these organizations? So being the head of a national sporting organization, or just being, or observing, say, like the head of a team sport and things like that. What are some of the, were there any common threads of really successful programs that you've witnessed, been a part of, as opposed to ones that haven't been as successful?
So I think one of the beauty aspects of the AIS job was that I started at a time when the whole thing was really new. So it was small and it was agile, and the people that were there were real pioneers, and we had a lot of fun creating the AIS. So the best years of my life. And then sometimes what happens is too much structure gets happening around it, and you start getting different ways of doing things, and there's a whole lot of sort of red tape, and suddenly becomes all about KPIs and short-term contracts and getting consultants to come in and doing continual reviews. And sometimes I understand that it's necessary sometimes to have transparency and to make sure you're on the right track, but it does take a lot of the joy out of things. And so, it got to the point where the AIS then completely restructured and changed what it does, and it does another job now, and a lot of what it's doing is really successful, but it's not what it was when I was first there. And I don't know whether sometimes, staying small continues to allow individuals to be able to drive it in a way of innovation that keeps it exciting. And that if once you get too big, then you just have to have so much structure around it to keep it transparent and going off the rails that then it gets overburdened with that level of structure around it. But it generally comes down to the people. Like there are just organisations which crackle because they've got some incredible people working for them who produce so much just passion, and not just good work, but it's the whole vibe around it. It's the whole feeling, and they inspire other people, and everything happens. It becomes more than a sum of its individual parts. And I've certainly had that experience at the AIS with some incredible people, the Dave Martins, the Alan Hahns, the Dick Telfords, Peter Frickers, there's just so many wonderful people who came and were there at the onset, and through their sheer personal characteristics made it so much better than just the sum of their individual expertise. And I mean, if you look around the world now, there's a lot of organisations that have looked at what the AOS model was and then produced their own version of it and had very successful outcomes.
Yeah, AUT did something quite similar.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And, you know, you look at Norway now, they're the real powerhouse. They're just amazing with very small population and incredible outcomes at the sports that they focus on.
Is Norway the country that has the where the synergy and collaboration between, there's a couple of key different universities with their National Institute of Sport, with a couple of different professional sporting federations as well, and it's all there's from memory there was 4 or 5 key sort of foundational pillars that can be completely integrated.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think the clever integration is one part of it, but again, the size thing is probably also contributing to it, that when you're a small enough group, you can corral people and get everyone moving in the same direction. Once something gets too big, it does have the advantage of having a lot of resources. And in terms of sporting success, you know, having a large population means it's easier to pop out some champions just through, you know, sheer luck. But, you know, sometimes the effort to get it all working in the same direction is tricky. I go to the US often, and they have an incredible college sports system, and then they have some incredible individual professional sports, but they don't have a coordinated effort to produce Olympians. And that drop off post-college is often for many sports just a death knell. And you sometimes think, gosh, if, you know, with all the ingenuity in the US and the resources and the population base, if they ever got their act together, no one else would ever win another medal. But for some reason, it just doesn't strike them that that's an output that they want to you know, put their direction of resources in.
I mean, yeah, I'm extremely naive in saying this, but my experience in America, especially when we were dealing with just getting an approved and recognized insurance product there in sports nutrition, was that it's trying to get national consensus on something is just so hard. It's just all like, it is the United States, and everything's just run and operated at a state level. And so we were like the A&D, the Association for Nutritionists and Dietitians, or I think I've said that incorrectly, but it's the A&D for short, have a map, and they're like, these are the legal requirements based on the state for who can do what. So clinical nutritionists in 70 to 80% of the states are fine to practice, but even in 20% of the states, if you're a clinical nutritionist and registered with the A&D, you're actually breaking the law if you're not a dietitian. If they were to practice with people from that state or in that state. And so we were anticipating an 18-month process and 15 different insurance policies to come through. And we were really surprised when 4 months into the process, they were like, yeah, it's approved, and it's approved for every state. And we were like, what about the ones where it's illegal? And they were like, the insurance isn't illegal, so just make sure the members don't practice in those states and you'll be fine. We were just like, well, what's going on here? So America's a funny country, but I'm definitely...
And yet, you know, I'm just in the moment visiting colleges because my son's interested in a sporting scholarship in swimming. And you know that there's at least 200 different venues, colleges that have better facilities for sport than the Australian Institute of Sport. So, you know, success doesn't come just from having the resources. It's much more than that. And it's when you go over there, and there's, you know, the wow factor in just some of the opportunities that athletes have over there, but it just doesn't finish off with, you know, transferring all that in a coordinated effort.
Yeah.
Games.
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, to the facilities, like Sean's now I think he's dean or head of college for exercise and nutrition and performance sciences at USC, which is the #1 NCAA sporting college. And the facilities they have there are just ridiculous from what he's shown me. And I was blown away by AUT. And then for what they've got over there is just ridiculous. Yeah. I couldn't believe it. So in terms of like what these well-run programs look like versus, I guess, like the not so good, what I'm sort of picking up as well is like there's a certain point in scale where elements of bureaucracy would like creep in, and it sort of dilutes and takes away from what the initial ethos is. And so for anyone looking to, I guess, like be a real spark or be a part of something where you can have really positive impact. Probably looking for organizations and institutes that are really really closely aligned to that core ethos is, and aren't, I guess, diluted with too much bureaucracy is an important thing.
And the people.
Yeah.
I mean, if I was thinking about, what I'd do again or where I'd go again, it would be following people that you just think, wow, to be able to get up every morning and think anything could happen today because I'm going to be with you. That's exciting.
Yeah, that sounds awesome. All right. So what advice would you give to someone then who's looking for something like what you did, or to be a part of like the head dietitian or performance nutritionist for a professional sporting club or things like that? We've got one of our members now, I think, is doing some stuff with Real Madrid from memory, and so he'd had that burning passion for the last 8 years. Went through a non-traditional route through us to eventually get into his master's program as well, which was good. And then once he got accepted into his master's program, because actually this guy was just obsessed with football, grew up in Ireland, and I think I don't know if he mentioned or he said to me, or he said publicly, that he'd like really struggled with like ADD and ADHD. So traditional education was a real struggle for him. So he first got introduced to sports nutrition by seeing some of our stuff, that we have this certificate, which is basically like, it gives them a provisional license for about 3 years to register in a more provisional scope. And then from there, we have a few different institutes and universities that we work with that we now refer into. And we say, hey, if you want to get on your opens, then we want you to complete either a grad dip or a bachelor's. And so he was able to then apply for a practical grad dip program, and then use that to leverage in. And he got rejected a fair few times to different master's programs, but eventually got accepted into one with years of experience in the grad dip that he'd done. And now eventually is working for Real Madrid in Spain, which is really cool.
So you said 3 things, I think: passion, persistence, and patience.
Okay.
Because often the things that, you'll look back in life, when you look at your pathway, it'll all make sense when you look at it from now, looking backwards. But on the way forwards, it can sometimes feel a bit, it's not happening in the right amount of time, or it's not happening in the conventional way that I thought it was going to happen. But everything you do is going to contribute in some way to finally getting to the point that you feel really satisfied. And it's amazing, just, sometimes it's not what you thought it was going to be. Sometimes it could have been Real Madrid was always the goal for your person, but it could be that there was something else that happened, and when they got into it, it was the greatest job and brought the greatest satisfaction. And you look back and you think that all those little things you did along the way gave you the skill sets, or gave you the opportunity, or gave you some piece of the puzzle that eventually just all falls into place. So I'd say to people, just keep moving in a direction, and keep accumulating those experiences and the expertise, and keep accumulating people and networks and all those sort of even micro credentialing. I think is a great idea these days, that sometimes you can't take on a whole big thing, or you've got a big thing but it's not giving you everything you need, and so continuing to add small little pieces to your toolbox is really useful. And then one day that job opportunity will either be there, or you'll have created it for yourself, and you'll look back and you think, wow, it all makes sense now. But it didn't until you got there. And
so it just felt like discomfort,
impatience. It's not happening. I mean, I can look back so many times. I mean, I've spoken to people now, along who, can go back and reflect with me what was happening for me at the time. And they'll always say that I was someone in a hurry and I was often, impatient that it wasn't happening quickly enough. But, it was often just, as we've said, random luck that got you that next step, that got you closer. And, sometimes it was it's just a matter of serving out the time until it all comes together.
Okay, that's great. So we're moving on to something that anyone who knows me knows that I love. And Eric Helms always mentions that I'm sort of like the guy on this, but how did you first come across the concept or I guess like you're even like the inception of formalizing the concept of energy availability? Because I'm sure you saw it in practice, right? You're like, there's these things that we're observing. It's this, it probably had a previous label.
Yeah, so there's things that just weren't adding up with the whole energy situation. And I was very lucky at the AIS to be able to have a sort of a credible organisation that I could use resources to invite people to come and talk to us about things that we didn't have enough expertise in. And so I was able to invite Anne Laux to come and spend a couple of weeks at the AIS. And she was incredibly generous with sharing with us just her whole pathway of getting to the bottom of, what was happening, just explaining why. And it started off just being a female thing that, there was just female athletes that just weren't able to stay healthy or reach performance levels that you'd have hoped that they'd have been able to do. And it was, later found to be just this imbalance between their energy intake and the exercise energy expenditure. It just wasn't leaving enough energy to be able to make them fully functional and optimizing all the rest of what their body needed to do to reach their goals. And it's interesting now, like we've looked at it very much from a sporting angle. In the next couple of months, I'm going to be doing a presentation at ACSM, and I've invited somebody to come from the obesity field, because that's, another situation where energy restriction and sometimes over-exercising occurs, and we know that it changes metabolic rate. And it's interesting to think the obesity industry looks at that as it's a bit of a disappointment, because it means the rate of weight loss is going to be reduced if your metabolic rate is now lower. And so the energy deficit that you're creating to lose weight is now reduced. And so your rate of weight loss is going to be reduced. And so they see it from what's disappointing from my goals point of view, but because the benefits of the weight loss are producing all these health benefits, they're probably saying, well, it's still worth pursuing because we're getting all these benefits from the weight loss. But we look at it from the sport point of view saying, yes, but if you're not working at 110% of your function, then you're not going to be able to reach the goals that you want as an athlete. So it's more than just a disappointment that your metabolic rate is being compressed. We want to try and avoid that so that we can make sure that health and performance are being maintained in changes to energy availability. But then there's a third angle to it, which we have both overlooked, and I think it's important to start thinking about, is that we think that energy availability and this the thermogenesis, the adaptation to thermogenesis, so that reduction in metabolic rate that occurs in the energy crisis, we think of it as a bad thing. We think, it's terrible. It's not good for the weight loss, not good for athletic performance. But evolutionary biologists would actually say, no, it's a very good thing, because that's the way that we've survived as a species, because we couldn't in our past always assume there was going to be sufficient food to provide for the energy requirements of life. And so rather than just losing all our energy stores or becoming, unable to do what we needed to do because there wasn't energy to support it, we've been able to conserve energy and be able to turn off parts of our metabolism that wasn't critical in the short term to be able to make us survive these periods of energy crisis. And then when energy suddenly becomes available again, turn them back on and say, right, now we're fully functioning. So it was a survival mechanism, and it's been important in making us the apex predators of the planet. So we're starting to look at it now in a bit of a different light, to say that there's aspects of it that are beneficial, but we have to then think about the things that become disadvantageous for the specific purpose to which you're trying to apply your efforts, which in my case is sports performance. So let's think of it as, in some cases, having a period of low energy availability is advantageous. Athletes need to shape their body composition to meet demands for performance, and they also need to train hard. So they can't escape being in periods of low energy availability. And in fact, sometimes that's actually part of the improvement in their sports performance. But other aspects of low energy availability, and we don't know all the characteristics. It could be the magnitude of the energy availability loss. It could be the duration. It could be other factors around diet in terms of what that means to protein and carb intake. It could be genetic factors. It could be so many others, this overlay of other, what we're considering now to be moderating factors that take energy availability or a low energy availability situation and make it more risky in terms of producing an impairment to health and performance that's problematic for you.
Yeah. Something that I've observed anecdotally, because physique sports in the time that I've been in the industry have just completely blown up, is the relationship between energy availability and then body fat, like someone's body composition and like how low their body fat is. And so a lot of the physique sport community, so like Dr. Helms presented on this, I think it was about 8 months ago now, Michael, when we were in South Bank. Yeah. Maybe 5 months ago. And so he was one of the first people to, like, the physique side of the sport, or the physique sport crew tend to be like, oh, it's just all low body fat. And then you get the performance nutrition and performance dietetics people saying EA is really important. And there appears to be a bit of a synergy just there. But then to your point, genetics, behavioral characteristics, psychological things, all like it's such a systemically global thing that is affected. So yeah, like I find it super interesting, because I was sort of sitting there for a while and I was like, why is this person able to like dive for this period of time and be leaner and still perform really well, whereas this person, if they diet and then they're performing, that like they don't look as good, they're not in as good a shape, they're also performing really poorly, like what's going on here? And I couldn't put my finger on it. And then I saw some of the literature and I was like, this is explaining a lot. It's not explaining everything. But the younger me, I was moderating that. But the younger me in my early 20s, I was looking at this, I was like, yeah, wow, this is explaining a lot, almost all of it.
So we want simple answers. It's always, we want something that explains everything and there's no deviations. Whereas, as you go a bit further in life, you realize that everything is about context and nuance. And so you can have some general principles, but then you have to be able to say, but those principles can be modified in different ways so that individuals will have a different experience of it.
Yeah, definitely. So in terms of, we spoke a little bit about this before, but the way we think about EA, and to your point, the principle of EA, it's definitely an important principle that we need to consider. I'm currently working on like an updated lecture to help people understand, because from our end, we've been beating the drum so loudly where it's like EA matters, EA matters, EA matters. And so we want to add some nuance to that by talking about some theoretical considerations or like limitations of it. And I know that you're working on something to do with that, as well as aware of other projects that relate to that as well, where, am I correct in saying this? We can always edit it out. If not, I guess the position is now becoming, it's important, but trying to find a way to make things perfect for it isn't the way forward. What we want to look for is like signposts along the way for when it becomes more relevant.
Yeah. So the project you're alluding to, and I can say, is that I'm part of a working team for the IOC to do a REDS update, and that will be launched in June of 2023. So we're getting very close with, finalising how we would like to reposition REDS a little bit better. And part of what we'll be doing is trying to differentiate between what we consider adaptive low energy availability. So it's an inevitability, and it's often an advantage to a person's life and their sporting goals to have these periods of time where their change in either increasing energy expenditure from exercise or reducing energy intake from food is going to put them at a slight imbalance. But in the right context and for the short periods of time, that's not going to be a problem. The differential point at which it becomes problematic, LEA, and then can underpin a lot of these health and performance impairments. We don't know all the characteristics that make it benign to problematic, but there's possibly, some moderating factors that we can identify that might be about the magnitude and the duration of the low energy availability. But all these other individual characteristics probably also are going to be part of the mix. And what we're trying to get people to be better at doing is be able to pick up factors early where there's likely to be these impairments and try and prevent them from happening. But also to be more aware that we love in life to come up with these syndromes where everything's nice and neatly packaged up, and we always think it happens this way. And not forget that often some of the symptoms that we've associated with REDS are possibly happening for other reasons. And we always need to look for differential diagnoses because, sometimes it's really easy just to pigeonhole people. An athlete might walk in and they've got anemia or they've got low iron stores, and you might know that that can be one of the possible ways in which low energy availability can be manifested in the RED syndrome. But just because that athlete's presented with that doesn't mean they've got the whole RED syndrome, and it may not be low energy availability that's causing the problem in their situation.
Yeah.
So we're trying to get people to be more appreciative of the complexity of working with athletes and how energy and energy availability can become problematic, but it's not always, and that other things may be needed to be put into the picture when you're working with that individual to get to the bottom of what's going to help them to be better in their health and performance.
Yeah, I think of the Kirsty Elliott Sale paper from last year. It's not a paper, it was a case study that they looked at a female soccer player, and I forget the title. Do you know the one that I'm referring to? Yeah. And they suspected low energy availability. It was like a nutrition professional's intervention of low EA or something like that. And they suspected it, did blood work, DEXA for bone mineral density and all that stuff. And it basically came back negative. And what the observed amenorrhea that they thought was to do with low EA was probably more due, this is me recalling it, was more due to stress around being injured rather than even being in a low energy availability.
So it's much better then when you can treat the person as an individual and really look at what's happening with them rather than seeing them as a syndrome and then plugging it in and saying, right, now this must be all happening and this is what we're going to do to fix it up. So I think the new way moving forward is to have better tools to recognise and to treat people from their individual characteristics, and just more sort of depth of understanding how so many body systems, work and interact with each other, and they're not always going through the same pathway.
Definitely. And you've probably seen people with low EA a lot more than what I have. From memory, there's probably only 5 people that I've come across who have had chronically low EA, all of whom were endurance athletes where a low body weight was, I guess, like the pinnacle that they were aiming for. And so you might think, or people might think, oh, low EA, we'll just eat more. And that was what I observed. And because I was doing, we have a clinic with metabolic heart, so people coming in, we get referrals to run the RMR assessments as a part of suspected low EA. And I guess the thing that I observed, and I could be completely way off, but the strongest symptom was the psychological side of things. And so even though you could say, hey, you should be eating more, there's no way that they were going to be listening. And so that body image disorder, propensity for disordered eating, in alignment with their sport, was really prevalent with those people.
And look, I think we're also now recognising that that's not the only mental health issue that can be involved. Depression is often involved and has sort of a two-way relationship with low EA and REDS, and that
it provides a more
and so we need to be able to, again, treat people for what they're really presenting with rather than lumping them with the labels, because, you know, it's really difficult for some people to want to see treatment or receive treatment or have an assessment if they feel they're going to be packaged and labelled in a way. You know, if you do have an energy availability issue and you think that everybody thinks it's about disordered eating, there's no incentive for you to go and to have an assessment, because, you know, you're thinking, well, they're just going to think I'm crazy, or they're just going to think, you know, that I have this terrible problem. And although that is sometimes part of the whole mix, it's not always. And so to give people encouragement and bravery to seek advice early, you need to be able to take away some of that stigma and some of the labels, so that the athlete's going to feel confident that when they come in, they're going to be treated as an individual, and they're going to have all their symptoms and assessments looked at objectively, rather than, oh, you know, we've got you sorted out before you've even walked in the door. Here's
the system, the one size fits all.
There's the pigeonhole. You just got to be. We're going to smash you in that till you fit.
Just eat more food, and then you'll be fine. So you've got a saying, or it's not a saying. I've heard you speak a bit, and you like to relate sports nutrition to, I guess, or like how sports nutrition and correctly applied performance nutrition principles can be effective to people. And it's like wearing a new pair of runners now in 2023 compared to what the shoes that they were wearing in the 1900s, and the time difference that they've translated to, you know, from since their inception and with their innovations. So with that being said, how much further do you see we could advance with sports and performance nutrition? And do you see trends in specific areas where we could be?
Yeah, and look, I've been talking about running shoes recently because it's a bit of a different way of thinking about it than the petrol and the fuel and the car, you know, the racing car analogy. I mean, that's cliche, and I'm sort of moving over that. But, you know, for me, the running shoe one is really interesting because we can see how it's made changes, and you can look at the biomechanics and the efficiency and the economy of oxygen use with these new running shoes, and you can see how it makes a very tight association with performance, and that's being able to show improvements in performance in a way that's, you know, changed sport, because every world record has been broken in the last 5 years in endurance sport, largely because of the shoes. But it's not just that some of the things that we can offer with nutrition are acutely performance enhancing. I think some of the other things that, and the shoe analogy fits it well, is that some of the things that nutrition can do is to stop people having problems, and it's a chronically applied thing. So, you know, better shoes helps with injuries, and it might even help with just the enjoyment of running, so that you do it better, you know, and you do more of it, and you're consistent with your training program. So I like to think of nutrition as having the cherry on the top, in that it can, and you can, in acute studies, show that we can measure a performance improvement. And this is what nutrition did to help on the day. But we can also think of it as having that sort of long-term benefit, where by eating well over that period of time, you didn't get the sickness, you didn't get those injuries, that allowed you to be consistent with your application of training. And so you got to the starting line, like you got there on the day because you weren't sick or injured. And when you got to the starting line, your conditioning was so much better, and your psychology and confidence with just, you know, feeling how good you were on that starting line, which we can attribute to nutrition, means that your performance on that day is going to be better. So there's so many different facets that nutrition can offer. And, you know, some of them are really easy to see and measure, and some of them are more hidden and more, they may be more subjective. They may be sort of just, you know, lurking in the background, and we haven't recognised them just so well. But they're still important.
So no new beetroot supplement.
Well, there's going to be always those new things that jump out at you that, that there'll be that new swoosh or that new thing that you can do to the shoe to make it work better on the day. But I think sometimes it'll be about, we didn't quite know why you were doing so well on the day until we went back and we just discovered that all that training time that you're putting in, with the support of that particular aspect of nutrition, and it allowed you to do so much more effectively in terms of your resilience and your ability to absorb the training and your resistance to illness and injury. And so it'll be after the fact we'll realize that, gosh, that was a smart thing to be doing. And that's one of the things that I love about the food first approach to nutrition, in that there are times when having a processed form of nutrients made specifically compatible with when you need to consume it, so it's very practical to do, and that's a good time to be able to take those individual nutrients and put them in the form that you just need now. But the bigger approach to food first, where there's so many aspects of food, and some of them are individual nutrients or chemicals that we go back later and discover some benefit to, but some of it's about the matrix of food. And this is the really interesting thing we're finding now, that when food is consumed in its whole form, and sometimes it could be in combination with other things, there's more benefits to that than taking those individual nutrients that you thought were important and eating them in a different form. And so that's the fascination of nutrition, that we'll continually find something new and exciting about it. And whether or not we'll be able to take it to a new level and put that extra swoosh on the shoe, or whether it will be just about saying those shoes were good and now we know why, more about why that were good.
And now we'll just make more shoes like that. Yeah. That makes sense. And I, to your point, and some of our listeners may be aware of this, but a good example of it is a lot of the research looking at muscle protein synthetic response to whole eggs with yolks versus egg white only really demonstrates that the whole egg consumed in its entirety is more beneficial for like recovery and muscle protein synthetic response, which a lot of people, if you looked at the nutrient timing aspect and the fact that egg whites are higher in protein per grams per gram per gram, you could easily rationalize that or hypothesize that egg white should be theoretically. But to your point, we see to your point with the food first approach, we see that the whole matrix of the food tends to start demonstrating this stuff in the research then as well.
Yeah,
and that's just one area, and there's many. Yeah,
and look, sometimes it's the technique that you're using to measure something that means that you strip down the food. So in lots of cases, the protein literature has been led by tracer technology to be able to examine how new proteins are synthesized post-exercise. And so you need to get a very simple protein and label it to be able to do that protein technology work. And that's because the study's been done in whey, then everyone thinks, oh, whey is the only way that you can eat it. Instead of thinking logically, when's the time of your life when you grow and synthesize more protein than any other time? And it's when you're a baby. And what are you having then? You're having whey and casein and all those other proteins in milk, plus all the other matrix that goes in it. So, sometimes we can be too clever with learning a technique that allows us to measure something and then taking the wrong message from our findings, thinking that it was something special about what we measured, rather than thinking, yes, but in the bigger context.
Yeah, missing the forest from the trees. Yeah. You see that with a lot of the again in protein research, where they look at muscle protein synthetic responses at a mechanistic level with plant-based proteins, and it just doesn't translate to that, or there being much of a difference when we actually put it in like human controlled settings and then feed them different animal and plant protein sources. So Dr. Alan Flanagan presented on that 4 or 5 months ago as well, and came through with like an amazing array of like recently published research that's sort of like, hey, we think that like animal proteins are so much better than plant-based proteins, and plants are incomplete. But he was like, well, look, if you can get a complete plant protein source, there's really not that much of a difference when we actually just give it to people.
And look, sometimes it comes down to the context of use, because if you can eat enough calories and enough protein, then
and you're training,
and you're training, the differences between animal and plant become much less. But if you're dealing with a little old lady in a hospital who's frail and can't eat very much because of appetite and just low calorie levels, that's when you might start needing to get a bit more clever with, all right, well, we can only use a very small amount of protein, so what's going to get more bang for the buck?
Yeah, so, in that setting.
Yeah. And so, yeah, it's all about context.
What can they stomach? What's feasible? What do they look forward to? Yeah, all those things. Well, look, that was great. We've gotten through all our questions. That was fantastic. I don't have anything more. I think that's it. Did you have any final words?
Lovely to talk, and there'll always be things to talk about.
That's it. Thanks, Louise.